Mist swirled in the valley, and the morning light fell like a thin veil upon the damp woodland. Eyam, a small village nestled in the Derbyshire hills of England, remained as quiet and forgotten as ever in the spring of 1665. Encircled by hills, it was like a stone basin forgotten by the world, left outside the current of time. Sheep moved slowly in the distance, and ancient stone walls, like tree rings, delineated the village's boundaries. Yet, in such a seemingly motionless moment, the very earth seemed to tremble gently. Not an earthquake, but a disturbance of a deeper kind. The elders spoke of a wind that year that blew differently. It seemed to rise from the depths of an abyss, swept through the tree canopy, and at night gently nudged the eaves, whispering a language no one comprehended. Children began to dream of black birds circling the rooftops. Women discovered the well water had turned murky, and Reverend William Mompesson felt a cold draft rising beneath the pulpit during his sermons, as if souls were lingering at his feet. The villagers did not comprehend the true nature of plague. They understood sickness, they understood death, but the word plague always seemed linked to London, to distant ports, and to royal conspiracies. Eyam was enveloped by its landscape and shielded by ignorance. But as the unusual signs proliferated, an instinctive collective unease began to spread through the village. The creek's flow, too, carried a different sound. At night, people said, it no longer babbled, but murmured. Some claimed to hear it call names, while others whispered that the moonlight reflected in the stream revealed human facial contours. For several days, the morning mist lingered stubbornly, like an aura from another realm, enveloping the entire village. Dogs ceased to bark, and the church bells sounded heavy and indistinct, like a muffled chime heard in a dream. Reverend Mompesson's nightly prayers grew progressively longer. He had read in the Bible of Moses setting stone boundaries and sealing off mountains to avert catastrophic destruction. He began to ponder whether these ancient rituals could indeed exert power at the nexus of the divine and the human. Inside the stone church at the village's heart, he arranged a circle of candles around the pulpit. It was whispered that on certain nights, their flames would stir without wind, as if unseen forces moved through them. Meanwhile, the old herb woman known to villagers as Granny Meglet braziers at the forest's edge, burning dried mugwort and sage. In her eyes, ancient runes, passed down for a century, seemed to swirl, and she softly chanted Old English incantations said to stem from the esoteric traditions of Celtic druids. She warned the villagers, the air was poisonous, not merely with plague, but with a deeper spirit of corruption awakened from beneath the earth. After a gathering, the village men unearthed a deeply buried stone tablet bearing inscriptions in an unknown script that subtly echoed a particular relief on the village's bell tower. They reburied it, only to hear faint, fragmented sounds emanating from beneath the earth at night, like the rubbing of bones or whispers between stones. Everything seemed to presage something, the imminent arrival of a turning point. A place seemingly forgotten by time was slowly drawing closer to a convergence of destinies. And this destiny was not from a king's command, nor from the plague itself, but a calling that transcended both faith and reason, weaving through the ancient and beckoning from the future. Just as the wind gently whispered in their ears, this will be not merely a trial by pestilence, but a test of hearts, souls, and ultimate fate. It was in this very atmosphere that Eyam received the tailor's package. The fabric was carefully unwrapped, as if unveiling a door to destiny. And when the first unusual scent wafted from the cloth, all animals in the village simultaneously froze, as if heaven and earth had fallen instantly silent. No one knew that, besides the fabric, That package held death. The hills still whispered, and the flora remained unchanged. But from that moment, Eyam was no longer Eyam. It was moving towards a page of history, unaware how long this page would be inscribed. It was a morning in early summer 1665. Sunlight spilled onto the village path, and the flagstones shimmered with a damp glow. People emerged from their homes as usual, beginning their tasks of farming, shearing sheep, and mending houses. But in a small cottage to the north of the village, the door remained tightly shut. Inside, a young tailor named Thomas Wills eagerly unwrapped a parcel of cloth sent from London. It was a piece of fine wool, carrying the scent of the city and the hope of a new life. The fabric was soft, imbued with an unusual warmth. London had just experienced a terrible peak of the epidemic, but the plague had not yet reached the northern countryside, so Wills thought little of it. He draped the cloth in a damp corner by the hearth, preparing to sew a winter cloak for a wealthy family the next day. No one knew that the plague deity's tiny carriers, the fleas of the Black Death, had already subtly attached themselves to the fabric's fibers, like the dust of fate settling in his hands. Days later, Wills began to feel dizzy and feverish, followed by swollen lymph nodes and violent chills. His initial symptoms did not immediately draw attention. A young laborer falling ill was often attributed to evil spirits or a clash of hot and cold humors. But soon, his condition deteriorated rapidly. High fever, vomiting, delirium, and then swiftly decaying skin and unbearable groans of pain. When Wills drew his last breath, his cottage was filled with a strange odor, a mixture of cloth, herbs, and death. More disturbingly, his apprentice, who had also handled the cloth, fell ill shortly after. The disease was no longer an isolated incident, but began to spread as a series of unexplained deaths. People started to whisper, "It was brought by the cloth. It's the lingering shadow of the London plague. Perhaps it's God's punishment for arrogance." However, others believed someone had disturbed something they shouldn't have. An elderly stonemason quietly remarked that he had seen Wills alone by the old tomb in the churchyard the night before he fell ill, seemingly praying in hushed tones, or perhaps exchanging some kind of promise. The village's two rectors, the elder Thomas Stanley and the younger Maupassant, sat together for the first time, attempting to find an explanation through faith and reason. Stanley still firmly believed it was a divine trial, while Maupassant turned his attention to the package of cloth. He held a remnant of the fabric, examining it closely dry to the touch yet slightly blackened, its edges appearing singed. He recalled the Levitical laws in the Bible, which spoke of unclean things not to enter the camp. And this cloth, he realized, was the unclean source marked by destiny. The tension in the village grew heavier. People stopped gathering and began to avoid discussing Wills's death. Mothers sprinkled salt on their doorsteps. Herbalists tucked mugwort into window cracks. And the church bells subtly changed their timing, no longer ringing at dawn, but now at midnight, as if warning, as if keeping vigil. Even stranger, some who had nursed the sick remained unharmed, while others succumbed within days. This selective pattern of infection made people think of a will choosing its victims. The village children also began drawing strange totems, claiming to have seen them in dreams. Bird-faced people, figures in black robes, and a bell tower collapsing in flames. Finally, when a fifth unrelated villager fell ill without warning, the entire village at last realized this was not merely sickness, this was a judgment, or at least a trial. Had the cloth truly caused all this? Or was it merely a key that unlocked a sealed door of destiny? They did not know. But one thing they now understood. This was no longer just one family's misfortune. The fate of the entire village of Eyam was being swept into an unknown storm. From this moment, the whole village seemed to enter a labyrinth. Every choice, every gathering, every prayer was another step towards the end. Invisible threads intertwined above their heads, as dense as a spider web, binding them to an ancient tragedy about to unfold. The wind began to blow colder, and birds no longer roosted in the village. Moonlight cast amorphous shadows on the stone walls. People looked south, towards the road to the world, but they vaguely sensed that the true way out might only exist after embracing the courage to stay. After the third week, Eyam was no longer an ordinary village, but an intractable enigma. Death walked slowly through the streets, yet never announced itself loudly. People no longer busied themselves asking, "Who is sick?" but began to ask, "Can we still leave?" Every gaze avoided eye contact, and behind every window lay a soul awaiting revelation. It was at this moment that the decision finally descended. The village's two spiritual leaders, the aged Thomas Stanley and the young, resolute William Maupassant, stood together once more on the stone platform of the church. The two had long been estranged due to religious factional disputes, but now, united by shared fear, responsibility, and an older calling, they clasped hands again. That handshake was not merely a reconciliation in the eyes of the world, but more like a covenant unearthed from a rift in time. They would jointly lead Eyam to meet its fate. "We must seal the village." This was the sentence they declared to the villagers. Simple, yet echoing like a massive stone dropped into the heart of a lake, sending out countless ripples. This was a quarantine, with no king's decree, no military blockade, and no official order. Eyam made its own decision, guided by faith, reason, and an intuition stemming from deep within its soul, to actively isolate itself, severing ties with the outside world. They would keep the plague within the village, and within it, they would also seal their hope. The rectors and village elders selected 8 boundary stones at the forest's edge, along the village paths, and between the pastures leading to the outside. Small indentations were carved into each stone, into which vinegar was poured. These served as exchange points. If outside traders wished to continue supplying food, they would place goods by the stones and receive coins purified by vinegar. There was no direct contact, no verbal exchange, only a silent pact between stone and wind. The most famous of these was later known as the Plague Stone. It stood like an ancient relic, its stone pattern seemingly bearing faint, intricate symbols. Some said the shapes of the indentations originated from pagan symbols, intended to seal the plague's path on a spiritual level. On the night the village was sealed, the entirety of Eyam gathered around the church, torches ablaze, and over 100 villagers swore an oath in the flickering light, pledging never to step beyond the village's confines. Stanley, in a deep voice, read chapters from the Book of Revelation, while Maupassant concluded with a passage from the Psalms. "Lord, you are my refuge, my fortress." But they both understood that this was not just a plea to God, but also a challenge they would use human will to contend with the unknown will. The sealing of the village was not purely an act of self-sacrifice. It was an action steeped in ancient ritual. Granny Meg was once again invited to the village council. Though previously considered a heretic, people were now willing to trust any means of survival. She scattered fine mugwort and ash around the village's perimeter, chanting syllables no one understood. Some said it was an ancient Anglo-Saxon charm against disease, while others believed she was merely singing a lullaby passed down from her grandmother. At the same time, Villagers carved intersecting cross marks on their house doors, not for protection, but for accounting who had died, who remained. These crosses were barely visible in sunlight, but at night, under candlelight or moonlight, they seemed to seep a dark red glow, like souls crying out, trapped within the stone. Catherine Mompesson, the rector's wife, also displayed silent resilience at this time. Knowing that the plague could claim her life at any moment, she insisted on tending to the sick daily and telling stories to the children in the church, weaving a thin veil of hope with myths and sacred words. She said, "Stories can comfort the soul, if only for a moment." Life after the sealing seemed to enter a different temporal scale. Days were no longer measured by work, but by intervals of death. Each time the church bell tolled, it signified a soul's departure. The wind, too, seemed to understand the rhythm. It skirted the village entrance, never penetrating its heart, and the ring of stones on the hillside seemed to have struck a covenant with the spirit of the earth. No one knew for certain if these practices truly stopped the plague, but in the villagers' hearts, they had wrested their fate from fear, even if the cost was to entrust the entire village to God, to time, rather than to the plague's indiscriminate slaughter. They sealed not just the village, but their submission to death. They built not just boundaries, but a spiritual defense against despair. The July wind grew heavier. It no longer swept lightly through the treetops like silk, but lingered between the stone houses like a sigh blowing from a tomb. Eyam village had been sealed for months. News ceased. Letters stopped, with only occasional supplies silently exchanged by the plague stone, as if it were the last ritual maintained between deities and humans. Death continued to arrive, sometimes as swift as fire, sometimes as slow as mist. It had no pattern, no mercy. One family of 7 was left with only one survivor, while others mysteriously remained unharmed. Some began to wonder if fate was biased, while others became convinced that a spirit secretly presided over everything. It seemed less like a simple plague and more like a trial, distinguishing the timid from the steadfast, faith from betrayal, and the clarity of the soul from its dissent. The church no longer held formal mass. Instead, Rector Mompesson delivered sermons in the open fields. He led the people to gather on a grassy slope outside the village, where there was a circle of ancient natural rocks said to be the site of ancient pagan sacrifices, while others claimed they were marks left by fallen stars. Regardless of truth, under the plague, people were willing to believe that all mysterious things could be transformed into hope. During his sermons, he no longer recited only from the Bible, but quoted ancient poems, fables, and even Celtic and Roman maxims. He said, "God dwells between the stars and flesh, and also within your resolve." He instructed the people to use stones as offerings, carving their names into them and burying them in the earth, bearing witness for the deceased and for those still living. Meanwhile, death began to shift into an unspeakable state. Some bodies rapidly decomposed within hours of death, while others remained as if in a peaceful sleep for days. Granny Meg investigated corpses late at night, bringing back death flower pollen in black earthenware jars of flower said to bloom only beside fresh graves. She used this pollen to concoct sachets, hanging them by the sickbeds. Though there was no confirmed medicinal effect, the patient said the fragrance brought peaceful dreams, free of convulsions and hallucinations. There was an ancient well in the village, believed to lead to an underground layer of silence. Legend had it that medieval monks once practiced in the well, listening for divine words. Mompesson and Stanley descended into the well together to pray. It was said that in the darkness they heard echoes like human speech, But after returning to the surface, they both remained silent for several days, and no one knew what they had heard below. Time seemed to coalesce around these rituals. Nightly sermons, the burning of dark herbs, silent vigils by the well, kneeling before crosses. The villagers' lives were no longer just a continuation of breath and heartbeat, but an ongoing dialogue with heaven and earth and with unknown forces. It was also during this time that Catherine Mompesson fell ill. She showed no violent symptoms, but simply lay down quietly one day, never to rise again. The rector stayed by her bedside daily, reciting psalms to her and softly telling her stories of the villagers, as if weaving for her a blanket composed of earthly memories and love. "I am not afraid to die," Catherine whispered to her husband. "But if you still live, please continue to tell our story for me." Those were her last words, and a trust to tell Eyam's story, to pass on their choice. On the night she died, a remarkably bright comet's tail appeared in the sky, streaking across the northern heavens. Villagers emerged from their homes, standing by stone walls, on hillsides, and by the plague stone, gazing up at the light that pierced the silence. None of them called it a miracle, but everyone at that moment felt this village had been seen by the cosmos. Their sacrifice was no longer silent. Their suffering was no longer solitary. Their perseverance, it seemed, was solemnly recorded by an unseen hand in that starlight. And when dawn illuminated the village, the wind remained crisp, but the birdsong returned. The first chirp sounded on the rector's eaves, then the second, the third, as if the world was breathing and spring was returning. Death had not ended, nor had the trial. But the villagers had transformed from a group of terrified survivors into a community of watchmen bound by a shared vow. They had sealed the village, not just for survival, but to protect each other's dignity, faith, and souls. They were not a people consumed by plague, but a people who dared to look plague in the eye and dance with it. As the autumn wind swept across Eyam village's stone walls and barren lands, that small world, once tightly enveloped by fear, began to show a subtle shift. The grass no longer bore only yellow and brown vestiges, but subtly revealed hints of green. The sunken footprints at the village entrance were covered layer by fallen leaves, as if history was healing itself. From spring to autumn, over 260 villagers fell in this trial. Eyam lost half its population, yet the village still lived, not just in a physiological sense of survival, but in its will and spiritual presence. It was not consumed, rather it stood firm amidst consumption. The outside world finally heard their story. Rectors, scholars, and travelers from Sheffield and Derby arrived outside the village, standing by the plague stone, softly reciting the ancient names carved into its surface. They did not cross into the village. The villagers had not yet removed that last silent barrier. But they offered wreaths, stone carvings, and parchment tributes as a sign of respect. Eyam became a name of legend, not for tragedy, but for choice. When facing annihilation, this village did not flee, but stood firm, transforming into a shield, building a boundary of flesh, blood, and faith for all of Derbyshire, for the broader countryside. Rumors spread that certain surviving families dreamt of their deceased loved ones at night. They were not ghosts, nor did they carry sorrow, but smiled quietly in their dreams, as if comforting the living. "You did well. We did not die in vain." On the last night of the sealing, Granny Meg lit 3 sticks of incense, burning with the scent of herbs and ash by the church door. In the ashes, she drew a closed circular symbol knot for exorcism, nor for blessing, but symbolizing a completion. The plague had not entirely left, but Eyam's wheel of trial had completed a revolution, and a new beginning was about to unfold. Reverend Mompesson planted a white rose by his wife's grave. He said, "Not for remembrance, but for a reminder this is not an end, but how we move beyond this chapter." His voice no longer carried prophetic solemnity, but a gentle simplicity. He was no longer merely Eyam's shepherd, but the chronicler of this epic. The village children gathered again by the stone walls, chasing each other, as if death had never descended. But in their games, there was a strange new order. They built models of the plague stone with small rocks and arranged branches to depict the well's opening. They were playing, but also silently inheriting. Eyam's story was no longer just words. It had been etched into the collective unconscious, passed down through generations. The earth returned to silence, and the wind no longer carried wails. But in certain deep nights, elders by the hearth would still hear a faint echo of church bells from the distant grassy slope that was the place of the outdoor sermons. No one knew for certain if there truly was a sound, but all who heard it awoke the next day with a clearer heart, as if some grace had quietly descended. Today, standing at the boundaries of Eyam village, seeing those still standing plague stones, the sealed ancient well, and the wildflowers on the hillside, you might ask, did all this truly happen? Was the plague truly contained by them, or merely granted a reprieve by fate? But perhaps these are not the true answers Eyam leaves us. What it wants us to remember is not the numbers of the plague, nor the details of suffering, but the courage of that choice, that even when facing the unknown, facing death, there were those willing to use their free will to draw a circle of light, guarding against darkness, ever crossing the line. The story will slowly draw to a close, just as stars eventually return to the firmament and rivers to the sea. Eyam's flame no longer burns fiercely, yet it continues to warm, deep within, all who have heard its story. It is a small chapter in world history, but an indispensable page in the human soul. May everyone who hears the name of Eyam know, we too were fire. We too can be light. Thank you for completing this journey. May your path be as steadfast as the people of Eyam. And may you, in darkness, remember that some always chose not to flee, but to await the dawn.